Have you ever had something really bad happen to you and have someone tell you not to think about it? Maybe it was because a really bad mark affected you, or someone said something to you in a way you didn't really like. Now, if I had to guess, the reason that someone said this was probably to get you to stop worrying about it, which is reasonable. But I would also guess that this didn't actually work as intended, and you probably even thought about it more. Now, obviously, this is a natural reaction to experiences bothering you, and it's not a bad habit at all. If anything, it's probably for the better, because that advice, don't think about it, pretty unhealthy, actually. Because you know what that's called? Do you know what that's called when you actively try your hardest to refuse the acknowledgement of your issues? That's called denial, and as you probably know, that's not the best thing. Another thing that this is referred to as, and what we'll refer to it as for the remainder of this video, is suppression. Suppression of thought, suppression of worry, and suppression of potential damage. However, there are instances where people might forget experiences permanently for a similar reason. This is called repression, which is denial as well in a similar sense. The only real difference between these two mechanisms is that suppression is a fully voluntary, conscious decision for the individual, while repression done isn't even known to the individual most of the time. Furthermore, repression is performed under significantly more drastic and harsher conditions. It's when a memory is so bad that suppression doesn't cut it anymore, as the individual is too mentally scarred to do it themselves, so their mind gets involved, effectively making that memory nothing more than a part of them, never to be seen again other than perhaps glimpses of their personality. Now, you might be thinking that's grim. You'd be right, and it only worsens when you realize that repression is generally caused by deeply rooted, serious traumas that can morph an individual's personality, sometimes for the better, but if the individual is not careful, usually for the worse. Now, this ISU focuses on these two topics as well as anything that they may be correlated to. This involves behaviors, environments grown up in, as well as dreams. Oh yeah, by the way, this video is formatted sort of similarly to the project itself, so this is, I guess, part 2. So yeah, it's just me blabbermouthing about articles that I found, so, you know, yeah. The internet is a beautiful thing! Here we go. The first article I found goes over Sigmund Freud and his ideology of the mind, which I found to be very good at explaining the effects of repression and suppression, as well as the consequences of performing specifically repression over this article, which are arguably more severe than that of suppression. But we'll get to that. Let's talk about everyone's favorite excuse for some of the most disgusting fetishes that should be considered signals for help, Sigmund Freud. Known for psychoanalysis, the psychosexual stages, penis envy, and the iceberg analogy of the mind. Imagine you're boating in the middle of the north, and you so happen to spot an iceberg. Now you see clearly that the iceberg is partially above the water, but then you start to think, just how much of it do you really see? An insane amount of the iceberg is usually submerged underneath the surface of the water, most of it usually not being even visible. These different portions of the iceberg, the portion that is surfaced above the water, the portion that is underneath the surface of the water yet still visible, and the portion that is completely submerged beyond sight, can be referred to as the conscious waking mind, the subconscious sort of limbo mind, and the unconscious slumbering mind. This is because people tend to only really show a surface portion of themselves, and often keep what's on that surface on a need-to-know basis. The subconscious mind is for non-essential info and memories that are usually remembered when brought up or reminded of. But there's also stuff that is pushed down, you know, the aforementioned suppressed memories. And the unconscious mind, where human memories that are considered too traumatic or too irrelevant are forgotten and ingrained into the human psyche. And the term ingrained is not used loosely here. There are plenty of symptoms of repression that are both easy and somewhat difficult to pin down. Among the easy, less specific ones are dizziness, fatigue, headaches, chronic pain, and anything that comes with stress. However, there are stronger and more specific and unfortunately harder to pin down symptoms, which includes things such as phobias and supposedly subject matter in dreams, which was actually the topic of the next article. Now, since when you're dreaming, you are sleeping, you would argue that you're unconscious, right? You could argue that through the process of going to sleep, you're slowly slipping from conscious to subconscious to unconscious mind, right? You could argue that you're going down the iceberg. which is to say that you're exposed to everything that is down there. Everything repressed, as well as things that may have been brought up when you were conscious of thought, explaining why people often claim to dream of the last thing they thought of. That all manifests in your mind as you sleep. For those who have experienced repression in the past, these manifestations can range from unpleasant experiences with parents as a result of having had similar experiences while awake, to being chased down in dark corridors by creatures you're not even sure are making the noises you're hearing as a result of fear of the dark and closed spaces. The problem with having these dreams, though, is that these manifestations are still considered experiences of the mind, meaning that any trauma experienced in a dream is still trauma and can still affect you. And so, behold, the I don't want to go to sleep because I had a bad dream and I don't want to go through that again feedback loop. When you have a traumatic experience, have it repressed in your unconscious mind in some way, shape, or form, and then dream about it and have it worsen your condition through more trauma. Hell, this idea of little things being able to affect people doesn't even stick to dreams alone. Terms of trauma have broadened so widely that there is such thing as secondhand trauma. This isn't even part of the thing, I just wanted to bring this up. Secondhand trauma is a form of trauma gained from hearing too much trauma from other people. Literal secondhand. Oh gee, I wonder who that might entail too. Whatever, the point here is that anything that the mind sees as traumatic is trauma, no question, and that includes stuff that can be found in dreams. Funnily enough, this is why lucid dreaming has been a somewhat active research topic, mainly so that the individual is able to better understand themselves as well as just to better understand the mind in general through being, like, conscious while unconscious. It's weird. It's cool. Regardless, there is another defense mechanism that hasn't been talked about that was mentioned from the start: suppression, or the I don't want to think about it complex. The act of suppression is both voluntary and very much something that the individual is aware of. It's essentially the act of putting off a thought considered unpleasant but not damaging to deal with later on, or to continue the refusal of acknowledging the issue. You could probably tell which one's healthier. The thing is, though, these coping mechanisms that come into play with suppression usually come into play as more short-term highs. This is why the effects of repression are only arguably worse. It depends on whether or not one considers long-term's effect of messed up memories worse over the temporary usage but potentially long-term addictions of really bad denial mechanisms. And I say addictions because, well, usually these coping mechanisms are drugs. To better explain a kind of synopsis of these ideas, we could once again return to the iceberg analogy, but slightly modified by me because now there's internal levels and two people living on this iceberg, whom we will name Idris and Ego. Ego is professionally inclined and focuses on cleaning things up on the iceberg by managing what it considers to be important or detrimental to their home, and cares not for minor inconveniences. Idris, however, deals with these minor inconveniences as best they can, and as much as Ego allows them to. The three consciousness levels are different little floors on the iceberg, a platform on the top to represent the conscious aware mind, the subconscious being the gap between the unconscious depths, and the unconscious being a trash room where everything becomes a part of the ever-expanding iceberg. Ego lets Idris do basically whatever he wants with the junk he doesn't consider important. Idris usually either keeps it on the deck or does whatever he feels like it on the second floor, which is a giant collection of drawers and compactors. The third level, however, is off-limits to Idris, as Ego manages significantly bigger and more damaging loads crashed on the deck by bringing them to the compactors on the third level. The third floor can only be accessed by Idris when Ego is fast asleep. Ego never misses a rest. Idris, however, often sneaks into their room to see what they can find whenever Ego is asleep. Regardless of what they can manage or if they even get along, they live together for the same lifespan and have no other choice. The main reason this is representative of the mind is because, you're not ready for this.
Electric skill so far they can be used as jet fuel!
I woke up my cat getting that soundbite. The id, representative of what the individual considers a desire, is ideal for the management of small things bothering an individual, otherwise the master of suppression. And the superego, representative of what both the individual and the mind consider a need, manages anything that is genuinely a harmful detriment to the human psyche, or the experienced specialist for needed repression. For the id, management mostly includes trying to keep unpleasant memories in the subconscious forever. For the superego, management involves the immediate ridding of anything detrimental to the human mind via placement in its depths, only to be explored by the individual through dreams. Idris, representative of the id. the waking, the slumbering, and aware mind. And ego, representative of the superego, demonstrating the objective behaviors of the uncontrollable, often confusing, potentially harmful, but always well-meaning human psyche. Well, this little joke got surprisingly deep. I mean, that's good. It's the best explanation I can give while keeping this whole thing interesting. I guess the key takeaway is that the coherent mind ego is kind of an enigma. He acts weird, but never really does or says anything unless it's necessary. Idris is meant to be the more understandable one, as he is a representation of the individual. For me, he is me.
Wait, what?
And for you, he is you. The best way to understand ego in this case is to see what he does as best you can. Try to connect behaviors, see how these habits might relate, and see how you can help your mind. Whatever, survey time. So the survey mostly just went over stuff that was regarded through this video, you know, suppression, repression, dreams, phobias, all that stuff. Plus some stuff regarding environmental and living conditions. The main two issues faced through this survey was that the main demographic was teenagers and it only had like 20 people. But at the same time, the survey takers were fairly varied in terms of people taking it, because thanks to this being over Google Forms, I managed to get people taking the survey in the United States. God bless Google, God bless its technology. Here's some quick facts regarding stuff that we already know. Those who answered what coping mechanisms were used for dealing with trauma in the optional questions section claimed that they indeed used denial as a coping mechanism, at least for the most part. And of course, as mentioned earlier, denial involves both suppression and repression. Those who answered honestly here were pretty frank throughout the rest of the survey. About 50% of those who took the survey claimed to use repression for most bad memories based on speculation on what they remembered throughout their younger years. Roughly 60% of those undergoing the survey went over specifically suppression, indicating that a good amount of people tend to try and genuinely learn from their experiences rather than just tuck them away. Which is good, most would argue, but, you know, it's only 40%. It's still debatable how much fears and phobias caused by traumatic repression translate into subject matter in dreams, but it's an absolute yes as to whether or not subject matter and experiences can translate in the first place. There's just too many cases of subject matter in the conscious mind being so incredibly specific to an individual's cause and situation. And finally, the environmental factor. Most spent more time around friends because, you know, it's teenagers we're talking about here. Physically, it was about 46%. In terms of online spending with friends, it was about 55%. Those who spent a large portion of time around family were 55% as well, and tended to be more inclined towards signs of suppression of minor trauma rather than repression due to major trauma. Considering select families put a lot of pressure on kids for varying reasons, it's entirely possible that those who choose to spend more time with their parents are due to trauma not being commonly associated with them, cementing their family as a place of comfort for that individual. This could also explain why those with more repressive tendencies spend more time around friends. Their family is a major cause of trauma in their life, and as a result, they want to spend significantly less time with their families to help the repressive process. After all, among the most common causes of trauma are childhood neglect and any kind of abuse, be it religious, physical, verbal, emotional, etc., which are unfortunately most common among broken households. Now, is the data obtained revealing? Yes, very. The original anticipation was that at least 80% of those taking the survey would have demonstrated some form of denial at some point, but it's relieving to see that 20% less did so. Regardless of this, the case is going to be that people always have something bothering them. Anything as minor as a bad day can ruin somebody's mental mood and should be talked about no matter the circumstances. What was worrying was looking through the survey and finding that some people, very few people, but some people nonetheless, claim to have zero issues whatsoever in a few cases. That is to say, almost none of the optional questions were answered, and a lot of mandatory questions seem to indicate minimal issues and experience with suppression or repression. Now, if you've done a survey before, you know that objective information is usually mandated to be taken at face value. But at the same time, if you're a human being with, empathy and common sense, you might recognize this as a red flag. It's common to have one or the other, perhaps both repression or suppression as experiences in one's life. That being said, this group being the very few couple of people that claim to have a basically perfect mental state, tells that there could be very much something amiss. Whether this is due to pride or fear or any other factor, keeping issues from others actively trying to help is not only active suppression, but, as stated a lot through this, very unhealthy. This plays into the best thing that can be done to help yourself if you find yourself performing these things. talking, explaining, connecting with other people. If there's anything bothering someone to any regard at all, the most important step to take is to be open and willing to talk about it, as those who took the survey indirectly were. Ails should absolutely be talked about openly, especially when they're mental, because at the end of the day, one person can only help themselves for so long, and if people have stuck around someone for that long, then clearly those people care enough about them to help as well. Also, in case I have time, in case I have time to keep editing this, I'm gonna include some pieces of media in this little section of me talking that I think go over like trauma very well. This is a little extra bit that I just wanted to add. I'm a sucker for pieces of media that mean something, and I do have some in mind as I'm recording this, so yeah, if you know about these, cool. If you don't know about these, check them out. They're really good. Anyways, that's it. Thanks.